Good morning. My name is Father Clinton Sensat, and I am the pastor of St. Thomas More Catholic Church in Eunice and the Catholic chaplain at LSUE. And I'm joining you this morning to continue discussing indulgences within this year of mercy, and in particular within these episodes to discuss the foundation of indulgences. And right now we're discussing God and the mystery of God's justice and mercy. And today I want to discuss the will of God and what the will of God means, especially in regards to justice and mercy. As we look through the writings of the great saints of the Church, St. Bonaventure, St. Albert the Great, St. Thomas Aquinas, Blessed John Duns Scotus, we realize that the will of God is a rather complicated thing, at least as it appears to us, because in God all things are simple. But we who move back and forth underneath the mystery of God's will can often have difficult time understanding it, and even about speaking about it. Sometimes we talk about God commanding something. Sometimes we talk about God prohibiting something. Sometimes we talk about God counseling something, advising us to do something. Sometimes we talk about God's will as what's expressed in the pages of sacred Scripture. And sometimes we talk about God's will as what actually happens in reality. And that's where we talk about the perfect and the permissive will of God. And so there are a lot of different aspects to God's will, at least as it appears to us. And it's important to have a rather deep meditation on God's will and to keep some of these concepts clear in order to understand God's mercy and God's justice. So what I want to do first today is I want to discount two rival claims about God's will that are completely wrong and can easily lead us astray because they do tend to seep into our minds from the kind of culture we have today. And the first account comes from the Franciscan William of Ockham. And William of Ockham said that God is so free that his will is completely arbitrary. That if he wanted to call what is evil good and what is good evil, then it would switch like that. And suddenly sin would be righteousness, and righteousness would be sin. That if he wanted to set ants above human beings and make dogs our masters, he could. What grows from William of Ockham is this sense that God's freedom is the same thing as God's fickleness. That God is just arbitrary, that God just does whatever he wants to do, kind of like a 2-year-old with a tyrant, right? Just going around doing all kinds of different things, whatever he wants, having no guidance there. So William of Ockham shows us the fickle God. Another account that really influences us today is from the Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza from the 17th century. And Spinoza said, rather blasphemously, that nature itself is God, that plants and trees and sky and all of these things are God himself, and that God is not distinct from nature, and therefore God's will is nothing else than what goes on, kind of the natural laws that move around. And Baruch Spinoza influenced a lot of our scientists and a lot of our early political thinkers who founded America and other countries. And they began to think about God's will as set, absolutely set in stone. And so Baruch Spinoza presents us with a God who is fate. And yet the reality of God's will is somewhere in between God being fickle and God being bound by fate. And so what do our saints tell us? That God's will proceeds from his wisdom, that God reflects deeply on the truth, and that he chooses things in wisdom. He shows mercy to whom he will, and he shows justice to whom he will, but he does all things in accordance with his wisdom. Now, sometimes that's difficult for us to understand. How is it part of the wisdom of God that someone turn away from confession and never come back? How is it part of the wisdom of God that someone who lived a completely sinful life would be converted and come fully into the Catholic Church? We don't know. Because as God himself tells us, my thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways. And I don't think any of us are going to compare our wisdom to God's wisdom. But we do know that what God does, he does not because he's a fickle tyrant, nor because he's somehow powerless and bound by fate, but that he acts according to wisdom. In wisdom he shows justice. In wisdom he shows mercy. And part of that wisdom, as we even see among ourselves, is a certain firmness of purpose. And so what I want to say today is sometimes I think we veer toward God being fickle with mercy. That God says, this is a sin, you shouldn't do it, but meh, what the heck, I'll forgive you, no problem. Or we tend to see God being bound by mercy, that God somehow owes us mercy, and that mercy is something we're entitled to, that God has to give us mercy, and that God's will is bound by fate. And yet neither of these are true, that God's mercy proceeds from his wisdom and from his set purpose. So when we think about God's will, we need to see how God has already acted in our lives. For many of us, we were baptized as infants long before we could do anything that we might even think would own or earn mercy from God. And yet, nevertheless, God chose us from the beginning to be his own beloved children. And he has shown us mercy and mercy and mercy throughout our lives. In his wisdom, knowing what we need at certain times. In his wisdom, guiding us to be faithful to his word because he is faithful to us. My brothers and sisters, God's mercy is not something that descends upon us like the whim of a teenager, nor is it something that we're entitled to. God's mercy comes to us from his faithful love that demands fidelity from us, but that remains steady as God guides our life, as God reproves us, as God lets us know his justice, but as God also fills us with his love so that we might know his glory and live with him forever, rejoicing in his wisdom. God bless you all.